The dust kicked up around Florence Foster's worn boots as she walked down the main street of Westcliff, Colorado, with her two sons clutching at her threadbare skirts. And the gnawing hunger in her belly reminded her that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The year was 1877, and the summer heat beat down mercilessly on the small mining town nestled in the wet mountain valley. Her husband had been dead for 3 months now, killed in a mining accident that left her with nothing but debts and 2 mouths to feed. Samuel was 8 years old, tall for his age with his father's dark hair, and little Benjamin had just turned 5. His face still round with the remnants of babyhood, despite the hollowness that hunger had begun to carve into his cheeks. Florence stopped in front of the general store, smoothing down her faded calico dress and tucking a strand of honey-colored hair back into the loose bun at the nape of her neck. She had tried every establishment in town already. The hotel had no need for another washerwoman. The saloon keeper had looked her up and down with eyes that made her skin crawl before telling her he had no work for a respectable woman. The boarding house was run by a widow herself who could barely make ends meet. Florence had even offered to clean the church, but Reverend Matthews had simply shaken his head sadly and told her that the congregation could not afford to pay anyone for such services. She was down to her last option. Mr. Henderson, who owned the general store, was known to be fair, and she had heard that his wife was poorly. Perhaps they needed help with something, anything. Florence took a deep breath and pushed open the door, the bell above jangling cheerfully in stark contrast to the desperation she felt. The store was dim after the bright sunlight outside, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, bolts of fabric, tools, and all manner of necessities that seemed like impossible luxuries to her now. Mr. Henderson stood behind the counter, tallying numbers in a ledger. He looked up at the sound of the bell, and his expression immediately became guarded when he saw her. "Mrs. Foster," he said neutrally. "Mr. Henderson, I apologize for disturbing you, but I was hoping you might have some work available. I can clean, I can cook, I can help stock shelves or keep your books if needed. I learned my letters and numbers at my father's knee, and I worked in his store back in Missouri before I married." Florence kept her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly where she held them clasped in front of her. Mr. Henderson's face softened with sympathy, but he was already shaking his head. "I am sorry, Mrs. Foster, I truly am. With my wife being sick, money is tight. I cannot afford to hire help right now. I wish I could do more." Florence felt her heart sink, but she forced a smile. "I understand. Thank you for your time." She turned to leave, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. Samuel and Benjamin followed her silently. They had learned in the past few weeks not to complain, not to ask for food they did not have, not to voice their fears. It broke her heart to see them so subdued. As they stepped back out onto the wooden sidewalk, Florence tried to think what to do next. They had been evicted from their small house at the edge of town 2 weeks ago when she could not pay the rent. Since then, they had been sleeping in an abandoned lean-to behind the livery stable. The owner had not discovered them yet, but it was only a matter of time. She had sold everything they owned except for the clothes on their backs and one thin blanket they shared. "Mama, I am thirsty," Benjamin said quietly. Florence looked down at her youngest son's upturned face. His blue eyes, so like her own, were too large in his thin face. She had given the boys the last of their bread that morning and had gone without herself. There was no money for more food, no money for anything. "Let us go to the pump, sweetheart," she said, trying to keep her voice cheerful. At least water was free. They walked down the street toward the town pump when a man emerged from the building next to them. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin. He wore dusty work clothes, a worn hat pushed back on his head revealing light brown hair that needed cutting, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. What struck Florence most, however, were his eyes. They were a startling green like new grass after spring rain, and when they fell on her and the boys, they held a kindness that made something in her chest tighten. The man tipped his hat. "Madam." Florence nodded politely and tried to move past him, but Benjamin, in his thirst and exhaustion, stumbled. The man reached out quickly and steadied the boy with a gentle hand. "Easy there, young fellow," he said, his voice a warm baritone with the slight drawl of someone who had spent time further south. He looked more closely at Benjamin, and Florence saw concern flicker across his features. "You folks all right?" Pride warred with desperation in Florence's chest. "Pride lost. We are managing, thank you for asking." The man's eyes moved from Benjamin to Samuel to Florence herself, and she saw understanding dawn in them. He had seen enough of hardship to recognize it. This close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the weathering of someone who spent his days outdoors, and something else too. A loneliness that seemed to echo her own. "Name is Franklin Keller," he said, removing his hat entirely now. "I have a ranch about 5 miles north of town." "Came in for supplies." "Florence Foster," she replied. "These are my sons, Samuel and Benjamin." Franklin Keller looked at her for a long moment, and Florence felt herself flush under his scrutiny. She knew what he saw. A woman too thin, with dark circles under her eyes, wearing a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible in places. A woman at the end of her rope. "Mrs. Foster, I do not mean to be forward, but I could not help but overhear you speaking with Mr. Henderson just now. I was in the store earlier, waiting for my order to be filled up, and I stepped out for some air when you came in, but the door does not close fully and sound carries." He paused, turning his hat in his hands. "You are looking for work?" Florence felt a flutter of hope. "Yes, sir. I can do most anything that needs doing. I am a hard worker and I do not complain." Franklin nodded slowly, seeming to consider something. "I have a proposition, though it might be a bit unusual. My ranch is nothing fancy, but it is profitable enough. I run cattle and have been breaking horses for the army. Problem is, I have been living like a bachelor for the 5 years I have owned the place. I can cook beans and bacon, but not much else. The house is in a state. I have been meaning to hire someone to help with the domestic side of things, but most folks in town have their own situations, and the few I have asked were not interested in traveling out that far every day." He seemed to be choosing his words carefully, and Florence waited, her heart beating faster. "What I am trying to say, Mrs. Foster, is that I could use someone to keep house, do the cooking and cleaning, maybe help with the vegetable garden I have been neglecting. There is a bunkhouse that has not been used since my ranch hand moved on last year. It needs some fixing up, but it would provide you and your boys with a roof over your heads, and I would pay you a fair wage on top of that. You would have your own space, your own privacy. The boys could help with light chores as they are able, nothing too hard. I would make sure you all had plenty to eat." Florence stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. "You would do that? You do not even know us." "I know enough," Franklin said quietly. "I know what it is like to be alone and struggling. I know what it is like to need a hand up. And I know that sometimes folks just need a chance." There was something in his voice, a pain that suggested he spoke from experience. Florence felt tears sting her eyes and she blinked them back rapidly. "That is incredibly generous, Mr. Keller. I do not know what to say." "Say yes," he replied with a small smile. "I promise you it is a legitimate offer. You would be doing me a favor, honestly. I am tired of my own cooking and the place could use a woman's touch." Florence looked down at her sons. Samuel was watching Franklin with cautious hope, while Benjamin had moved closer to the cowboy, clearly drawn to his gentle manner. She thought about the lean-to, about the hunger, about the fear that had been her constant companion since her husband died. This was an answer to prayers she had been too tired to voice. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, Mr. Keller, thank you. You will not regret this. I promise you I will work hard." "I do not doubt it," Franklin said, "and please call me Franklin. If we are going to be living on the same property, we might as well dispense with the formalities." He settled his hat back on his head. "I need to finish collecting my supplies and then we can head out. Are you staying somewhere in town? Do you need to collect your things?" Florence felt her face heat with embarrassment. "We do not have much to collect. What we have is with us or nearby." She saw understanding and something that might have been anger flash in Franklin's eyes, though she sensed the anger was not directed at her. "All right then. Why do you not take the boys to the restaurant down the street and get them something to eat? Tell Mrs. Chen to put it on my account. I will meet you there in about 30 minutes. Mr. Keller, Franklin, you do not have to." "I know I do not have to," he interrupted gently. "But those boys are hungry, and there is no reason they should wait another few hours until we get to the ranch and I can get a proper meal together. Please, it would make me feel better." Florence felt the tears threaten again. It had been so long since anyone had shown her such kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. Franklin tipped his hat again and headed back toward the general store. Florence watched him go, wondering what twist of fate had brought this man into her life at her darkest moment. Then she took her son's hands and led them toward the restaurant, hardly daring to believe their luck had finally turned. Mrs. Chen was a practical woman who asked no questions when Florence relayed Franklin's instructions. She simply nodded and brought out bowls of beef stew with fresh bread and butter. Samuel and Benjamin tried to eat slowly, to mind their manners as Florence had taught them, but their hunger got the better of them. Florence ate more slowly, savoring each bite, watching her sons and feeling something unknot in her chest. Franklin appeared just as they were finishing, carrying a burlap sack. "I picked up a few extra things," he said casually. "Figured the boys might need some sturdier clothes for ranch life, and I grabbed some fabric and notions too. I hope that was not presumptuous." Florence opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. She had no money to buy the boys new clothes, and their current ones were nearly falling apart. "That was very thoughtful. Thank you." Franklin paid Mrs. Chen, then led them outside to where a sturdy wagon waited, hitched to 2 patient horses. He helped Florence up onto the seat, then lifted both boys into the back where they could sit on the bags of supplies. The burlap sack with the clothes and fabric he tucked carefully beside them. As they rolled out of Westcliff, Florence found herself relaxing for the first time in months. The afternoon sun was still warm, but a breeze had picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains that rose dramatically to the west. The Sangre de Cristo Range dominated the horizon, their peaks still touched with snow even in summer. "How long have you been in Westcliff?" Franklin asked as he guided the horses north along a well-worn trail. "Almost 2 years," Florence replied. "My husband heard there was work in the silver mines. He was a hard worker, good with his hands, but the mines are dangerous. There was a collapse in March. He and 7 other men were killed." "I am sorry for your loss," Franklin said, and there was genuine sympathy in his voice. "Thank you. He was a good man, a good father, but we had not been here long enough to build up much. The mining company paid for the burials, but nothing else. The debts piled up quickly after that." Florence paused, then added, I have tried to find work. I'm not looking for charity. I know you are not, Franklin said. And this is not charity. I genuinely need help at the ranch. You will earn your keep and then some. He was quiet for a moment, then added, I lost my wife 4 years ago. Different circumstances, but I understand something of what you have been through. Florence glanced at him, surprised. I am sorry. That must have been very difficult. It was, Franklin acknowledged. She died of fever. We had only been married a year. We were planning to start a family, build our life together. Then she was gone, and I was left trying to figure out what to do with a dream meant for two. He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. I poured myself into the ranch, worked from sunup to sundown. It helped, keeping busy. But there are some kinds of loneliness that work cannot fix. Florence understood that all too well. After the initial shock of her husband's death had worn off, after the practicalities of survival had consumed her days, she had felt that particular loneliness keenly. The absence of partnership, of someone to share burdens with, to make decisions with. How old are you, if you do not mind my asking? Franklin said. I am trying to figure out if I should be calling you madam, or if we might be close enough in age to be less formal. I am 26, Florence said. I married young at 17. I am 32, Franklin said. So not so far apart, and please, I meant what I said earlier, call me Franklin. Mr. Keller makes me feel like an old man. Florence smiled, a real smile this time. All right, Franklin. And you should call me Florence. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. In the back of the wagon, Samuel was pointing out landmarks to Benjamin, his voice carrying that particular excitement children get when their circumstances are improving. Florence felt herself relax further into the seat, the sway of the wagon almost soothing. The ranch appeared as they crested a small rise. It was nestled in a valley with a creek running through it, cottonwoods and willows marking its path. The house was modest, built of logs with a wide front porch. A barn stood nearby, along with several outbuildings and corrals. Cattle dotted the pastures beyond, and Florence could see horses in one of the nearer enclosures. It is not much, Franklin said, and she could hear both pride and self-consciousness in his voice. But it is mine. Well, mostly mine. I will have the bank note paid off in another few years. It is beautiful, Florence said honestly. After weeks of sleeping in a lean-to, after months of worry and fear, the ranch looked like paradise. Franklin pulled the wagon up to the house and jumped down, then came around to help Florence. His hands were warm and calloused as he steadied her, and Florence found herself very aware of his proximity, of the solid strength of him. She stepped back quickly, flustered. Franklin lifted the boys down, then grabbed some of the lighter supplies. Let me show you the bunkhouse first, get you folks settled. Then we can work on supper. The bunkhouse was a smaller log structure about 50 yards from the main house. Inside, it was a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end, a pot-bellied stove for cooking, and several bunks along the walls. There was a table with chairs, some shelving, and hooks for hanging things. It was dusty and clearly had not been used in some time, but the roof looked sound and the floor was solid. I know it needs work, Franklin said apologetically, but the structure is good. We can clean it up, and I have extra bedding and dishes up at the main house you can have. There is a pump right outside for water. It is wonderful, Florence said, and she meant it. It was a palace compared to where they had been staying. We can have this livable in no time. Tell you what, Franklin said, why do you not bring the boys up to the main house? We will get some supper going, and tomorrow you can work on fixing this place up however you like. No sense in you trying to settle in tonight when you are all tired. Florence wanted to protest, to maintain some sense of propriety, but she was tired, and the boys needed a good meal and a safe place to sleep. "Are you sure? I do not want to impose." "You are not imposing. I invited you, remember." Franklin smiled at her, and Florence felt her breath catch slightly. He really was handsome, she realized, in a weathered, authentic way that had nothing to do with conventional attractiveness and everything to do with character showing through. The main house was larger than it had looked from outside. The front door opened into a large main room with a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and windows that let in plenty of light. Beyond it, Florence could see a kitchen area with a good-sized stove and a table. Doors led off to what she assumed were bedrooms. The place definitely needed a woman's touch, as Franklin had said. There were dirty dishes stacked in the kitchen, dust on most surfaces, and a general air of neglect. But the bones of it were good, and Florence could see the potential. "All right," Franklin said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let me show you where things are, and we can get some food going. Boys, there is a pump out back and some soap. Why do you not go wash up?" Samuel took Benjamin's hand and led him outside. Franklin opened cabinets, showing Florence where he kept flour, beans, salt, and other staples. The larder was well stocked with preserved vegetables, smoked meat, and other supplies. "I am not much of a cook," Franklin admitted, "but I keep things on hand. Make whatever you think is best." Florence assessed the supplies and decided on fried potatoes with onions and bacon, along with some canned tomatoes heated up and biscuits if there was time. Franklin watched her work for a moment, then began helping without being asked, peeling potatoes with efficiency that suggested he was more capable in the kitchen than he let on. They worked in companionable silence, falling into an easy rhythm. When the boys came back inside, clean and with their hair slicked back with water, Franklin set them to setting the table. He showed them where the plates and utensils were kept, speaking to them with the same kindness he had shown their mother. Supper was ready as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They sat around the table, and Florence felt a lump form in her throat at the simple normalcy of it. A family meal, even if they were not a family. Full plates, a solid roof overhead, no fear. Franklin bowed his head. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the hands that prepared it. We thank you for bringing Florence and her boys here safely. Watch over us and guide us. Amen." "Amen," Florence and the boys echoed. The meal was eaten with enthusiasm, especially by Samuel and Benjamin, who had not had a home-cooked meal in far too long. Franklin praised the food generously, and Florence felt a warm glow of accomplishment. It felt good to be useful again, to have purpose beyond mere survival. After supper, Franklin showed her to a small bedroom. "You and Benjamin can take this one," he said. "Samuel, you can have the room across the hall. I will be in the back bedroom, so I will not be in your way." "Franklin, we can stay in the bunkhouse," Florence protested. "We are clean enough now, and I do not want to put you out of your own home." "Nonsense," Franklin said firmly. "The bunkhouse needs work, and you have all had a hard enough time lately. A good night's sleep in a real bed will do everyone good. We can sort out the bunkhouse tomorrow." "Please, Florence, I would not feel right making you sleep out there when there is room here." Florence was too tired to argue, and truthfully, the bed looked more inviting than anything she had seen in months. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You already are," Franklin said. "You are helping me. Do not forget that." That night, Florence lay in the comfortable bed with Benjamin curled up beside her, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt safe. She could hear the soft sounds of the ranch settling around her, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. From the room across the hall came the soft sound of Samuel's even breathing, and knowing he was comfortable and safe made her eyes fill with tears. She thought about Franklin Keller, this stranger who had shown her such extraordinary kindness. She thought about the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of his late wife, and the loneliness she recognized because it mirrored her own. She did not know what the future held, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt hope. The next few days fell into a pattern. Florence woke early, started breakfast for everyone, and then spent her days transforming both the bunkhouse and the main house. Franklin had been right about the bunkhouse needing work, but it was nothing she could not handle. She scrubbed every surface, washed the windows until they gleamed, and organized the space efficiently. Franklin brought over furniture and supplies without being asked, seeming to anticipate what she might need. The boys thrived in the ranch environment. Samuel took to following Franklin around, eager to learn about cattle and horses. Franklin was patient with him, explaining things carefully and giving him small tasks that made the boy glow with pride. Benjamin was still young enough to stay closer to Florence, but he loved playing near the creek and had adopted a half-wild barn cat that Franklin assured her was excellent at keeping down the mouse population. Florence found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life more easily than she would have expected. She cooked 3 substantial meals a day, kept the house clean, worked in the vegetable garden that had indeed been neglected, and began preserving food for the coming winter. It was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way her life in town had never been. What surprised her most, though, was how much she enjoyed Franklin's company. He was an easy man to be around, quiet but not withdrawn, thoughtful and kind. He never made her feel like hired help, always treating her with respect and consideration. In the evenings, after the boys were in bed, they often sat on the porch and talked. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about coming to Colorado to make his own way, about building the ranch from nothing. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her early married life, about her dreams for her sons' futures. One evening, about 2 weeks after she had arrived, Florence came out to the porch to find Franklin sitting there with a guitar. She had not known he played. "I did not mean to interrupt," she said. "You are not," Franklin replied, gesturing to the chair beside him. "I do not play much anymore, but I was thinking about it tonight." "Would you play something?" Florence asked, settling into the chair. Franklin's fingers moved over the strings, coaxing out a melody that was sweet and sad. He began to sing, his voice a warm baritone that sent shivers down Florence's spine. It was an old ballad about lost love and longing, and Florence found herself blinking back tears. When he finished, silence hung between them for a moment. Then Florence said softly, "That was beautiful. Why do you not play more often?" "It reminds me of things I lost," Franklin said simply. "My wife loved music, but maybe that is not a good enough reason to stop doing something that brought joy." He looked at her, and in the fading light his eyes were very green. "You have brought life back to this place, Florence. The house feels like a home again. I had forgotten what that was like." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "I am glad I can help. You have done so much for me and the boys. I want to do right by you." "You are," Franklin assured her. "More than you know." Another week passed, and Florence could not deny that her feelings for Franklin were growing beyond gratitude and respect. She found herself watching him when he worked, admiring the competent way he handled the horses, the gentle patience he showed her sons. She looked forward to their evening conversations, to his slow smile and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when something amused him. One afternoon, she was working in the garden when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw 3 riders coming up the trail to the ranch. Franklin emerged from the barn, and she saw his posture stiffen slightly. The riders pulled up near the house. They were rough-looking men, unshaven and dusty from travel. The one in the lead, a thick-set man with cruel eyes, looked around the property with an assessing gaze that made Florence uncomfortable. "Help you gentlemen?" Franklin asked, his voice carefully neutral. "We are looking for work," the lead man said. "Heard you might be hiring." "I am not," Franklin replied. "Sorry you came out all this way for nothing." The man's eyes moved past Franklin to where Florence stood in the garden, and she did not like what she saw in them. "That your wife?" "That is none of your concern," Franklin said, and there was steel in his voice now. "I said I am not hiring. You are welcome to water your horses before you move on, but that is all I can offer you." The man's jaw tightened, but after a moment he nodded curtly. "We will take that water then." Franklin showed them to the trough, his body language tense. Florence moved closer to the house, where she could see Samuel and Benjamin playing near the porch. She called them inside, and they came without question, sensing the tension. The men took their time watering their horses, and Florence watched from the window as Franklin stood by, clearly waiting for them to leave. Finally, they mounted up, but as they turned to go, the lead man called back, "Nice place you got here, Keller. Real nice." There was something in his tone that felt like a threat. Franklin stood motionless until they were out of sight, then strode quickly to the house. "Are you all right?" he asked Florence as soon as he came inside. "I am fine." "Who were they?" "Drifters, probably, maybe worse." Franklin's jaw was tight. "I do not like the way they looked at the place, or at you." Florence felt a chill. "Do you think they will come back?" "I do not know," Franklin admitted. "But I am going to be extra watchful for a while. Keep the boys close to the house." That night, Franklin checked and rechecked the locks on all the doors and windows. He showed Florence where he kept his rifle and his pistol, and made sure she knew how to use them. She had fired a gun before, though not often, and his precautions made her nervous. "I do not want to frighten you," Franklin said, "but I believe in being prepared. Most likely they will move on and we will never see them again. But if something does happen, I need to know you can protect yourself and the boys." Florence nodded, understanding the weight of what he was saying. That night, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the ranch and trying not to imagine every noise as someone approaching. But the next few days passed without incident. The men did not return, and gradually the tension eased. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythm. Florence found herself grateful for the peace, and even more grateful for Franklin's steady presence. One morning, nearly a month after she had arrived at the ranch, Florence was hanging laundry when she heard Samuel cry out. She dropped the sheet she was holding and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding. She found Samuel near the barn, sitting on the ground and holding his arm, tears streaming down his face. Franklin was already there, kneeling beside the boy. "What happened?" Florence asked, dropping down next to them. "I fell out of the loft," Samuel said through his tears. "I am sorry, I know I was not supposed to be up there." "Let me see," Franklin said gently, carefully examining Samuel's arm. The boy winced but did not pull away. "I do not think it is broken," Franklin said after a moment, "but it is definitely sprained. We need to wrap it and keep it still." Together, they got Samuel into the house. Florence gathered bandages while Franklin fashioned a sling. They worked together seamlessly, and Florence was struck by how much of a partnership they had developed. Franklin was as concerned about Samuel as if he were his own son, and Samuel clearly trusted him completely. Once Samuel was settled with his arm wrapped and strict instructions to rest, Florence walked outside with Franklin. "Thank you," she said, "for taking such good care of him." "He is a good boy," Franklin said. "They both are. You have done an excellent job with them, Florence." Despite everything you have been through, Florence felt tears prick her eyes. "I worry sometimes that I am not enough, that they need a father and I cannot give them that." Franklin was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "They need love and security and someone who believes in them. You give them all of that, the rest will work itself out." Florence looked up at him, at this kind man who had given her so much. "You have been good to them too. They talk about you all the time. Samuel wants to be just like you when he grows up." Franklin's expression softened. "That is quite an honor." He paused, seeming to struggle with something, then added, "Florence, these past few weeks with you and the boys here, it has made me realize how much I was just going through the motions before. I had forgotten what it felt like to have people to care about, to look forward to coming inside at the end of the day. You have given me that. I want you to know I appreciate it." "I appreciate it too," Florence said quietly. "More than I can say." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, and Florence felt the air between them charge with something unspoken. Then Benjamin called from inside, breaking the moment, and they both turned to go back to the house. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Florence and Franklin sat on the porch as had become their custom. The night was warm, the sky brilliant with stars, and the sound of crickets filled the air. "Can I ask you something?" Florence said. "Of course." "Why did you really offer to help us that day in town? You said you knew what it was like to struggle, but there is more to it than that, is there not?" Franklin was quiet for so long that Florence thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My wife, Margaret, she was an orphan. Grew up in an institution back east, never knew her parents. When she came west, she was looking for a fresh start, for a place to belong. We met at a church social, and I fell in love with her almost instantly. She was bright and funny and saw the world with this amazing optimism despite everything she had been through." He paused, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "When she got sick, I did everything I could to save her, brought in doctors, tried every remedy. Nothing worked. She died in my arms, and with her last breath, she made me promise that I would not let bitterness ruin me, that I would stay open to life, to people, to possibility." He looked at Florence. "I have been trying to keep that promise, but I had gotten pretty good at just existing rather than living. Then I saw you in town, and I saw your boys, and I saw the desperation and the fear and the determination all mixed together. I saw Margaret in you, I think, the courage to keep going even when everything is against you." Florence felt tears slide down her cheeks. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary person." "She was," Franklin agreed. "And so are you, Florence Foster." Florence reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Franklin turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands in the darkness, neither one speaking because words seemed inadequate for what they were feeling. Summer deepened into its hottest weeks. The work on the ranch was constant but satisfying. Franklin hired a couple of local men to help with haying, and Florence fed everyone hearty meals 3 times a day. Samuel's arm healed quickly, and he was soon back to following Franklin around, though with a new awareness of safety. Benjamin started helping his mother in the garden, his small hands surprisingly deft at pulling weeds and picking vegetables. Florence and Franklin continued their evening conversations, and the hand-holding became a regular occurrence. They had not spoken of it, had not defined what was happening between them, but Florence felt it growing stronger every day. She caught herself thinking about him at odd moments, remembering the way he laughed, or the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the horses. She wondered if he thought about her too. One evening in mid-August, Florence was washing dishes when Franklin came up behind her. She felt his presence before she heard him, a warmth at her back. "Need any help?" he asked. "I am nearly finished," she replied, very aware of how close he was standing. "Florence," he said, and something in his voice made her turn around. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I need to tell you something." "All right," she said, her heart starting to pound. "These past 2 months have been the happiest I have had in years. Having you here, having the boys, it has reminded me what it means to have a family, and I have come to care for you, more than care for you." He took a breath. "I am falling in love with you, Florence. Maybe I have already fallen. I did not plan for this to happen, but I cannot deny it anymore." Florence felt her eyes fill with tears, but they were happy tears. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it was too soon, that I should not feel this way, but I do." Franklin reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "It has only been 2 months since we met. I know that. And maybe people will say it is too fast, that we should wait. But I have learned that life is short and uncertain. When you find something real, something true, you should not let it slip away." "I agree," Florence said, leaning into his touch. "I want to do this right," Franklin said. "I want to court you properly, to give you time to be sure. But I also want you to know my intentions. When you are ready, when you think it is right, I would be honored if you would marry me. I would be honored to be a husband to you and a father to your boys." Florence felt a sob catch in her throat. "You would do that? Take on 2 children who are not your own?" "I would be blessed to," Franklin said firmly. "They are wonderful boys and they are part of you. I would love them as my own, Florence. I already do." Florence reached up and covered his hands with her own. "Yes," she said. "When the time is right, yes, I would be honored to be your wife." Franklin's smile was radiant. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Florence did not want to. She rose up on her toes to meet him, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Franklin rested his forehead against hers. "We will take our time," he said. "There is no rush. But knowing you feel the same way I do, knowing we are moving in the same direction, that means everything to me." They spent the rest of the evening on the porch, talking about the future they would build together. Franklin wanted to expand the ranch, to build a bigger house someday where they could have more children if Florence wanted. Florence talked about her dreams for Samuel and Benjamin, about wanting them to have education and opportunities. They talked about small things too, about daily life and shared responsibilities, about the practical details of merging their lives completely. The next few weeks had a dreamlike quality. Franklin began openly courting Florence, bringing her wildflowers he picked on his rides around the ranch, helping her with her chores so they could spend more time together, playing with the boys and showing them in 100 small ways that he cared about them. Samuel and Benjamin responded to his affection eagerly, and Florence could see them starting to view him as a father figure. One evening at dinner, Samuel asked, "Is Franklin going to be our new papa?" Florence and Franklin exchanged glances. They had not yet told the boys about their intentions, wanting to make sure the relationship was solid first. "Would you like that?" Florence asked carefully. "Yes," Samuel said immediately. Benjamin nodded enthusiastically, his mouth too full of food to speak. "Well," Franklin said, smiling at them, "I would like that very much too. Your mama and I have been talking, and when the time is right, we are planning to get married. That means I would become your stepfather, but I hope you would just think of me as your father. I would be honored to have you as my sons." Samuel got up from his chair and threw his arms around Franklin's neck. "You are the best papa we could ask for," he said. Franklin hugged him back, and Florence saw tears glisten in his eyes. Benjamin climbed into his lap, and Franklin wrapped an arm around him too. Florence felt her own tears spill over at the sight of the three of them together. That night, after the boys were in bed, Franklin said, "I do not want to wait too long. Is that all right? I know it might seem fast to other people, but we know what we want. And the boys deserve stability, deserve to know for certain that this is forever." "How long were you thinking?" Florence asked. "Another month or two. That would make it about 4 months since we met." "Long enough to satisfy propriety, but not so long that we are just wasting time." Florence thought about it. Her husband had been dead for 6 months now. She had loved him, but that chapter of her life was over. Franklin represented a new beginning, a new chance at happiness. 2 months, she said. That would put us in October before the weather turns bad. We could have a simple ceremony here at the ranch. "Are you sure?" Franklin asked. "I can afford to do it properly to give you a nice wedding." "I do not need a big wedding," Florence said. "I just need you and the boys and the knowledge that we are building something real together. That is enough for me." Franklin pulled her into his arms, and Florence rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You have made me the happiest man alive," he murmured into her hair. The next day, Franklin rode into Westcliff to speak with Reverend Matthews about performing the ceremony. He came back with good news. The Reverend had agreed and had been happy to hear that Franklin was settling down. Apparently, there had been some concern among the church ladies that he was turning into a hermit out at his ranch. Word spread quickly through the small town that Florence Foster and Franklin Keller were getting married. Most people seemed genuinely happy for them, but there were a few raised eyebrows about the speed of the courtship. Florence tried not to let it bother her. She knew her own heart and she knew Franklin's. That was all that mattered. As September arrived and the leaves began to turn gold in the aspens that dotted the mountainsides, Florence and Franklin made preparations for their wedding. Florence sewed herself a new dress from fabric that Franklin bought her, a soft blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. Franklin commissioned new suits for Samuel and Benjamin from the tailor in town, much to the boys' delight. They decided to have a small gathering after the ceremony, inviting a few neighbors and friends from town. Franklin arranged for one of the local ranchers' wives to help Florence with the cooking, insisting that she should not have to work on her own wedding day. The night before the wedding, Florence stood in the garden as the sun set, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been desperate and frightened, with no idea how she would feed her children or keep a roof over their heads. Now she was about to marry a good man, a kind man who loved her and her sons. It felt like a miracle. "Mama," Samuel's voice came from behind her. Florence turned to see both her boys standing there, looking suddenly very grown up in their new clothes they had insisted on trying on one more time. "Are you happy, Mama?" Samuel asked. "About marrying Franklin?" "I am very happy," Florence assured him. "But I want to make sure you boys are happy too. This is a big change for all of us." "We are happy," Benjamin said firmly. "Franklin is nice. He plays with us and teaches us things, and he does not get angry like some grown-ups do. And he makes you smile again," Samuel added. "You did not smile much after Papa died, but you smile now." Florence felt tears sting her eyes. She knelt down and pulled both boys into her arms. "You two are the best sons a mother could ask for. I am so proud of you both. And I promise you, no matter what, you will always be my first priority. You and Franklin together, we are going to be a real family." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with that particular golden quality autumn light has in the mountains. Florence woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement. She bathed and did her hair, pinning it up carefully and leaving a few curls loose around her face. When she put on her new dress, she felt pretty for the first time in longer than she could remember. Franklin had spent the night in the bunkhouse to observe propriety, but Florence could see him from the window, pacing back and forth in his best clothes. He looked nervous, which she found endearing. People began arriving around mid-morning. Reverend Matthews came first, greeting Florence warmly and telling her how pleased he was to be officiating. Several neighboring ranchers arrived with their families, including the Thompsons who owned the spread to the east and the Walkers who ran sheep to the west. Mrs. Chen came from town, bringing a beautiful cake she had made. Mr. Henderson and his wife arrived, his wife looking much healthier than she had been. Franklin had set up chairs in front of the house, creating a makeshift aisle. Wildflowers that Florence had picked the day before decorated every available surface. It was simple but beautiful, and Florence felt her throat tighten with emotion at the care Franklin had taken. When everything was ready, Reverend Matthews took his place. Franklin stood beside him, looking more handsome than Florence had ever seen him in a new suit, his hair neatly combed, his face shaved smooth. When his eyes met hers across the distance, she saw love there so powerful it took her breath away. Samuel and Benjamin walked Florence down the aisle, one on each side, holding her hands. She had insisted on this, wanting them to be part of giving her away, part of this new beginning. As they walked, she could feel the eyes of the guests on them, but she only had eyes for Franklin. When they reached the front, the boys stepped aside, and Florence took her place next to Franklin. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, and she squeezed back. Reverend Matthews began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Franklin Keller and Florence Foster in holy matrimony. Marriage is a sacred institution, ordained by God, and these two come before us today to pledge their lives to one another. He spoke about love and commitment, about the challenges they would face and the joys they would share. Then he turned to Franklin. Franklin Keller, do you take Florence Foster to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Franklin said, his voice strong and sure. And do you, Florence Foster, take Franklin Keller to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Florence said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Franklin had purchased simple gold bands in town, and they exchanged them now, their hands shaking slightly as they did. By the power vested in me, Reverend Matthews said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Franklin, you may kiss your bride. Franklin cupped Florence's face in his hands, just as he had that first time in the kitchen, and kissed her gently. The guests erupted in applause and cheers. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears, but Reverend Matthews was not quite finished. There is one more thing, he said. Franklin has asked if Samuel and Benjamin would join us here. The boys came forward, looking curious. Franklin knelt down so he was at their eye level. Samuel, Benjamin, I want you to know that when I married your mother today, I also made a commitment to you. I promised to love you, to protect you, to teach you everything I know, and to be the best father I can be to you. You are my sons now in every way that matters. Will you have me as your father? Yes, both boys said together, and then they were hugging him, all three of them locked in an embrace that made everyone watching reach for their handkerchiefs. The celebration that followed was joyful and heartfelt. Everyone ate their fill of the food that had been prepared. The children ran and played, and there was music and laughter. Mr. Thompson produced a fiddle and played dancing tunes, and Franklin swept Florence into his arms and twirled her around until she was dizzy and laughing. As the sun began to set and the guests prepared to leave, everyone offered their congratulations and best wishes. Mrs. Chen hugged Florence tightly and whispered, "You deserve this happiness. Hold on to it." Finally, the ranch was quiet again, just Florence, Franklin, and the boys. They tucked Samuel and Benjamin into bed together in one of the rooms. Franklin had moved Florence's things into his room earlier, into what was now their room. When the boys were asleep, Florence found herself suddenly nervous. She stood in the bedroom, looking around at the space that was now hers as much as Franklin's. Franklin came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "I am more than all right," Florence said, leaning back against him. "I am happy, truly happy." "Good," Franklin murmured. "So am I." He turned her gently in his arms so she was facing him. "Florence Keller," he said, testing out her new name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," she said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "I never thought I would have this again. A partner, someone to build a life with." "Neither did I," Franklin admitted. "But I am so grateful we found each other. You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever. A sense of home, of belonging, of purpose beyond just surviving." Florence pulled him down for a kiss, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope for the future into it. Franklin responded in kind, his arms tightening around her. The rest of the evening was theirs alone, a celebration of their new union and the beginning of their life together. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Florence's life. Fall gave way to winter, and the ranch settled into the slower pace of the cold season. Florence reveled in her new role as Franklin's wife, in the partnership they built together. They worked side by side to prepare for winter, preserving food, repairing buildings, making sure the livestock were ready for the harsh weather to come. Samuel and Benjamin thrived under Franklin's guidance. He taught them to ride properly, to care for the animals, to do basic repairs around the ranch. He was patient with them, firm when necessary but always kind, and Florence could see them blossoming under his attention. The first snowfall came in November, blanketing the ranch in white. Florence stood at the window watching it come down, feeling Franklin's arms come around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How different my life is from a year ago," she said. "Last winter, I was watching my husband waste away from his injuries, terrified of what would happen to us. This winter, I am warm and safe with a husband who loves me and children who are happy. It feels like a dream." "It is real," Franklin promised, kissing the top of her head. "This is our life, and it is only going to get better." He was right. As winter deepened, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Evening found them all gathered around the fireplace, Franklin reading aloud or telling stories while Florence sewed and the boys played. Sometimes Franklin would get out his guitar and they would sing together, the boys' high voices blending with their deeper ones. Christmas was a revelation for Florence. She and her first husband had never had much money to spare for celebrations, but Franklin insisted on making it special. He took the whole family into town where they picked out small gifts for each other. He bought the boys new boots and warm coats, and for Florence, a beautiful shawl that must have cost more than she wanted to think about. Florence had knitted Franklin a warm scarf and made him a new shirt. She helped the boys make him drawings and small gifts from materials around the ranch. On Christmas morning, they all gathered to exchange presents, and the joy on everyone's faces was the best gift of all. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and with it came news that filled Florence with both joy and nervousness. She was pregnant. When she told Franklin, he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing with delight. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." Samuel and Benjamin were equally excited. immediately making plans for all the things they would teach their new sibling. Florence watched them with tears in her eyes, marveling at how thoroughly Franklin had become their father. They no longer spoke of him as their stepfather. He was simply Papa now, and he wore the title with pride. As spring turned to summer and Florence's belly began to swell, Franklin became almost comically protective. He insisted she do no heavy work, much to her amusement. He hovered constantly, making sure she was comfortable and had everything she needed. The boys took their cue from him, treating their mother like delicate glass. "I am not an invalid," Florence protested one day when Franklin tried to carry a basket of laundry for her that could not have weighed more than 10 pounds. "I am just pregnant." "You are carrying our child," Franklin said seriously. "That makes you the most important person in the world right now." Florence could not argue with that kind of devotion, so she submitted to being pampered with as much grace as she could muster. Summer passed peacefully. The ranch prospered, the cattle and horses thriving. Franklin hired on 2 permanent ranch hands to help with the increased work, and Florence found herself managing a much larger household. She did not mind. The work gave her purpose, and she loved creating a real home for her growing family. In late September, a year and almost exactly a month after she and Franklin had married, Florence went into labor. Franklin sent one of the ranch hands racing to town for the doctor and the midwife while he stayed by Florence's side, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. The labor was long but not overly difficult, and as dawn broke over the mountains, Florence delivered a healthy baby boy. Franklin cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son. "He is perfect," he whispered, watching as the midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket. "He is absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas Franklin Keller, and he was indeed perfect. He had a thatch of dark hair like Franklin's and blue eyes that Florence knew might change color as he grew. Samuel and Benjamin were entranced by their baby brother, constantly wanting to hold him and help care for him. Florence recovered quickly from the birth, and she loved watching Franklin with their son. He was a natural father, tender and patient, singing to Thomas in his deep voice and walking with him when he was fussy. The love between them grew even deeper, strengthened by this new life they had created together. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas grew into a bright, curious toddler. Samuel and Benjamin shot up like weeds, both showing signs of becoming tall, strong men like their father. Florence and Franklin added a daughter to their family 2 years after Thomas was born, a little girl with Florence's blonde hair and Franklin's green eyes, whom they named Margaret after Franklin's first wife. It had been Florence's idea, wanting to honor the woman who had shaped the man she loved. The ranch continued to prosper. With the help of the ranch hands, and as Samuel got older and could take on more responsibility, they expanded their operations. Franklin's reputation as a horse breaker grew, and he began getting contracts from the Army and from other ranchers across Colorado. Florence transformed the main house, adding on rooms as the family grew. She planted flower gardens that became the envy of the county and kept a vegetable garden that provided more than enough for their needs. She became known as a woman of competence and kindness, and other ranch wives often came to her for advice. But what mattered most to Florence was not the material success. It was the love that filled their home. It was the sound of children's laughter, the warmth of Franklin's arms around her at night, the sense of belonging and security that had once seemed like an impossible dream. One evening, about 5 years after their wedding, Florence and Franklin sat on their porch watching the sunset. The children were all inside, supposedly settling down for bed, though Florence could hear giggles from the bedroom the boys shared. "You remember the day we met?" Franklin asked, taking her hand. "Of course I do," Florence said. "I was at my lowest point, terrified and desperate, not knowing how I would feed my sons or where we would sleep. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen," Franklin said. "Standing there trying so hard to maintain your dignity even though you were falling apart inside. I remember thinking you were either a saint or a madman to offer work to a complete stranger with 2 children in tow," Florence replied with a smile. Franklin laughed. "Maybe a little of both. But mostly I just saw someone who needed help, and I was in a position to give it. I never imagined it would lead to this." He gestured to the house, to the ranch spread out before them, to the life they had built. "Neither did I," Florence admitted. "But I am so grateful it did. You gave me everything, Franklin. A home, security, love, a future for my sons, more children. A partnership. I do not know what I did to deserve you." "You deserve everything good in this world," Franklin said seriously. "And I am the one who should be grateful. You brought this place to life. You gave me a reason to look forward instead of back. You gave me a family." He paused, then added softly, "You gave me love when I thought I would never have it again." Florence leaned over and kissed him, still feeling that same flutter in her chest that she had felt that first time. "I love you, Franklin Keller." "I love you too, Florence Keller," he replied. "More than I can ever say." They sat together as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch around them. From inside, they could hear Margaret starting to cry and Samuel's voice soothing her, telling her a story. Thomas was singing to himself, a tuneless melody that still managed to be sweet. This was happiness, Florence thought. Not the absence of problems or challenges, because there were always those, but the presence of love, of partnership, of people to face those challenges with. It was knowing at the end of each day that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and growth. Samuel grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day operations of the ranch. He married a sweet girl from town named Sarah, and they built a house on the property so they could stay close to the family. Benjamin discovered a talent for working with wood and became a skilled carpenter, crafting furniture that was both beautiful and functional. He used his skills to help build additions to the ranch as needed. Thomas and Margaret grew up surrounded by love and security, never knowing the kind of deprivation their older brothers had experienced. They were confident and kind, raised with strong values and a solid work ethic. Franklin's hair turned gray at the temples, and lines deepened around his eyes, but to Florence, he only grew more handsome with age. She herself showed the marks of time and of bearing children, but Franklin never made her feel anything but beautiful. They added one more child to their family, a daughter they named Catherine, born when Florence was in her mid-30s. She would be there last, the doctors said, and that was all right with both of them. Their home was full and their hearts were fuller. One spring morning, when Florence was 40 years old and had been married to Franklin for 14 years, she found herself in the garden, much as she had been that first day she arrived at the ranch. But how different everything was now. That first garden had been overgrown and neglected. This one was carefully tended, bursting with new growth and the promise of the season ahead. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Franklin approaching. He was 54 now, his hair more gray than brown, but he still moved with that same easy confidence that had caught her attention all those years ago. "The garden looks good," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Thank you," Florence said, leaning back against him. I was just thinking about that first garden, how different it looked. Everything is different now, Franklin said. Better. Much better, Florence agreed. She turned in his arms to face him. Do you ever regret it? Taking in a widow with 2 children. Taking on all that responsibility. Not for a single second, Franklin said firmly. That day I met you in Westcliff was the luckiest day of my life. You and the boys, you saved me as much as I saved you. Maybe more. Florence reached up and touched his face, tracing the lines there with tender fingers. I think we saved each other. I think you are right, Franklin said, and then he kissed her, as sweet and full of promise as the first time. That evening, their entire family gathered for supper. Samuel and Sarah were there with their 2 young children. Benjamin brought the rocking chair he had been working on to show everyone. Thomas, now a teenager, was full of stories about the horse he was training. Margaret and Catherine chattered about the dress they were making together. Florence looked around the table at all these faces, these people she loved beyond measure, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This life, this family, this love, it was more than she had ever dreamed possible during those dark days after her first husband's death. After supper, after the children had scattered to their various activities, and the guests had gone home, Franklin and Florence took their customary evening walk. They strolled down to the creek, listening to the water murmur over the stones, watching the last light fade from the sky. Do you remember when you first asked me to marry you? Florence asked. You said you were offering me your last name instead of just work. I remember, Franklin said. Best decision I ever made. Mine too, Florence said. You gave me more than your name, though. You gave me a partnership, a love story, a future. You gave my sons a father and me a home in every sense of the word. We built it together, Franklin reminded her. None of this would exist without you. The home, the family, the love, that is all you, Florence. It is us, Florence corrected. Together. Together, Franklin agreed, and he pulled her close, holding her as the stars began to emerge overhead. They stood there for a long time. 2 people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had taken a chance on love when it would have been easier to stay closed off and protected. They had built something beautiful together, not just in the physical ranch around them, but in the family they had created and the love they shared. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Florence thought about that desperate woman who had walked into Westcliff begging for work all those years ago. She barely recognized herself in that person anymore. That woman had been broken by loss and hardship. This woman was whole, healed by love and partnership and the simple knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The house glowed with lamplight as they approached, warm and welcoming. Through the windows, Florence could see the children moving about, hear the sound of laughter and conversation. This was home. This was family. This was love, and it was more than enough. It was everything. The years ahead would bring more changes, more challenges, more moments of joy and sorrow as all lives do. But Florence faced them all with Franklin at her side, with their children growing and thriving around them, with the solid foundation of love they had built together. Sometimes, late at night when everyone else was asleep, Florence would lie awake and marvel at the journey that had brought her here. From widowhood and desperation to this rich, full life, it seemed like something out of a story. But it was real. It was her life. Her beautiful, blessed, hard-won life. And when she finally drifted off to sleep in Franklin's arms, she did so with a smile on her face and gratitude in her heart. She had been given a second chance at love and happiness, and she had seized it with both hands. The lonely cowboy had offered her his last name instead of just work, and in doing so, had given her the world. Years later, when Florence was well into her 50s and Franklin was approaching 70, They would sit on that same porch where they had shared so many evenings and watch their grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel and Sarah had given them 4 grandchildren. Benjamin had married and had 3 children of his own. Thomas was courting a lovely young woman from town. Margaret had married a neighboring rancher's son. And Catherine, their youngest, was still at home, though she too would eventually marry and start her own family. The ranch had been passed primarily to Samuel, though all the children had stakes in it and homes on the property if they wanted them. It had grown into one of the most successful operations in the valley, known for quality livestock and the integrity of the family that ran it. But none of the material success mattered as much as the love that had created it all. Franklin's hair was white now, and he moved a bit slower than he once had, but his eyes still lit up when he looked at Florence. Her own hair had gone silver, and her hands bore the marks of decades of hard work, but she still felt beautiful when Franklin smiled at her. "We did all right, did we not?" Franklin said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "We did better than all right," Florence replied. "We built something that will last beyond us, a legacy of love." "That is all anyone can hope for," Franklin said. He took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "I love you, Florence Keller. I have loved you since that day in Westcliff when you were too proud to admit how desperate you were and I was too lonely to let you walk away." "I love you too, Franklin," Florence said. "You gave me everything. You gave me your last name and with it, a whole new life." They sat together as they had done thousands of times over the decades, comfortable in the silence, secure in their love, grateful for every moment they had been given together. The lonely cowboy and the desperate widow had found each other against all odds and had built a love story that would be remembered and retold by their descendants for generations to come. And as the sun finally sank below the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Florence leaned her head on Franklin's shoulder and smiled, knowing that she had lived a life full of love, full of purpose, full of meaning. She had been blessed beyond measure, and she was grateful for every single day. This was her happily ever after, hard-won and deeply cherished, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined on that dusty street in Westcliff so many years ago. The widow had begged for work. The lonely cowboy had offered his last name instead. And together, they had built a love that would last forever.